69 South.
69 South.
69 South.
Welcome, everyone, to Podcast 69 South, where we cuss and discuss true crime, cold cases, current events, and hot topics, along with our state of society today. This is your trigger warning. Our podcast content is produced for adult listeners 18 years of age and older. We discuss situations that may be offensive and triggering to some listeners. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Welcome, everybody, to 69 South. I hope you had a good time since the last time. We have so much to get to today. With me always is my beautiful and sweet co-host, Julie. How you doing today, girl?
I'm good.
So if you guys have been following our Facebook, you guys have already known that we were the only podcast. We were the only anybody, basically, except for a couple of TV stations at the press conference releasing the probable cause affidavit that was for the Stafford case.
And what they did is, this is a transcript of pretty much, I guess, the grand jury hearing where they got an arrest warrant on these charges. And so that is what this is, and we're going to read it.
Basically, we're going to do this like a script. Julie is going to play the county
State's attorney.
The state's attorney, and I'm going to play the detective, Patrick Williams, which I got to say, up there on that press conference, man, he looked a little bit nervous, but that poor detective has worked tirelessly, I could tell you, on this case, man. 33 victims. He admitted, Stephen Sonja, they both admitted that this was more victims than they'd ever seen in any case in Morgan County.
One of the worst cases that they've ever seen.
So without any delay, we're going to start this transcript, and once again, I'm going to play the detective. Julie's going to play the state's attorney.
Detective Williams, can you please state your first and last name for the record?
Patrick Williams.
And how are you employed?
I'm a detective sergeant with the Morgan County Sheriff's Office.
How long have you been in that capacity?
I was formally promoted to detective in February of last year, so just, under a year.
And prior to being a detective, what was your role with the Sheriff's Department?
I was a corporal assigned to investigations where my primary duties were as the crime scene investigator for the Sheriff's Department.
And so you were assigned to work an investigation involving two individuals named Brian and Sonia Stafford?
Yes, I was.
What were the allegations at the beginning of this case when you were assigned to it?
The initial allegations that were reported to deputies the night prior were neglect allegations, physical abuse, and then it was later into their initial investigation the night prior that there were allegations of sexual allegations to include child molest and things of that nature.
And to give the court a little bit of context, you've been dealing with this investigation for about 6 months now. Close to that, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And this has been a wide-reaching investigation that throughout the time you have been working the case, you've learned that there were a total of 33 children in the Stafford home over 13 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and so we're here today seeking arrest warrants for both Brian and Sonia Stafford with a variety of different counts, probably close to maybe 50 for each of them. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and we're not trying to throw the book at them, but we're just trying to do justice for the harm that they've caused over the years to all of these kids.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so since there are so many kids that were in the house and we're talking about an investigation that spanned over a decade, did you prepare a probable cause affidavit in this case?
Yes, I did.
How long is this probable cause affidavit?
It's 100 pages.
And so throughout your testimony today, it's going to be necessary due to the scope and complexity of our investigation to refer to your probable cause affidavit.
Yes.
Okay. So throughout all of the different kids that you have spoke to or that have came up during your investigation, were there times that you found multiple children were consistent about certain things that were in the Stafford home that the court is going to hear about repeatedly today?
Yes, we had similar disclosures about different types of allegations between the children that were in the home.
Okay, and what were some of the things that were pretty consistent throughout all of the kids?
Some of the things that were consistent, a lot of the girls would talk about sexual abuse that they were victimized through from Brian. And then they also talked about physical abuse that they, as well, mental abuse they sustained at the hands of Sonja.
Did many of the kids talk about like a punishment structure of sorts that Sonja had put into place?
They did. They talked about what was called as they had beads or buttons like in a button box. Each child had their own designated color associated with them. If they earned buttons, they received a variety of different types of discipline, whether it was physical discipline, getting spankings. They had to run laps around the property. They were withheld food at times, punished by having to go to their room at early hours of the night and spend the whole night in their room. There was also times that the girls talked about having to write out sentences as part of their punishments. As far as those sentences go, the sentences were based off how old they were. So, for example, if one of the children was 13, they would have to find a Bible verse that was 13 words long, and then depending on the punishment, they got a variety or a range of how many sentences they would have to write.
And throughout the 13, I suppose the 11 named victims, did all of those kids in one way or another talk about the button box or the beads that you just mentioned?
Yes, they did.
And so I guess providing some background for the court, did you learn that some information about the Staffords and the property they owned at 56 Herbiemont Road?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and can you tell the court a little bit about that property that you learned during your investigation?
So the Staffords have owned that property, or did own that property, I should say, from 1996 until October of 2024 when they sold it. The property itself is about 23 acres. Initially, when they purchased the property, there was a few structures on the property, which some of the kids ranging from when they were first placed there, they kind of discussed. They had the main residence, then they had a small outbuilding or barn. As the years went by, the other kids that came to the home kind of talked about how the farm or the residence expanded. So this property got 6 or 7 larger buildings. There's a chicken coop. There's different varieties of barns on the property itself.
And in addition to learning about the property that the Staffords owned for a substantial amount of time, did you also learn that they had biological children of their own?
Yes, I did.
How many did the Staffords have?
They had 3.
And what were their names?
There was Cody Stafford, Kelsey Stafford, and Matthew Stafford.
And are all of the children currently alive?
No, just Matthew and Kelsey are alive.
What happened to Cody?
In 2004, Cody committed suicide.
And I know that throughout your investigation, there was some information that you learned about where Cody committed suicide. Can you inform the court about the circumstances surrounding the suicide?
I can. I was told in different interviews that Cody committed suicide at the foot of Brian and Sonia's bed in their bedroom.
And throughout your investigation, did Cody's suicide come up a couple of times when you talked to different witnesses?
It did. In several interviews discussing Cody's suicide, there was concern that Cody might have been led to actually committing suicide due to the treatment he was receiving in the home.
And what sort of treatment did you learn that he was receiving?
Well, during the interviews, people had expressed that he was treated differently. Some had talked about how he had a learning disability, and because of that disability, he wasn't treated as good as the other kids. The parents, as well as the biological kids, would make fun of him if he couldn't complete tasks, or just overall he was just treated much poorly than the other kids were.
After Cody's suicide, did Brian and Sonia become licensed foster parents?
Yes, they did.
And do you know when they became licensed?
It was 2008.
So between 2008 and 2024, how many children were placed in the Stafford home?
There was a total of 33 children, 32 of which either came through foster or adoption, and then there was a foreign exchange student that came into their home.
Were any of these children that were placed in their home between this time period adopted?
Yes, there was 11 children that were actually adopted.
And did you, during your investigation, learn that the Staffords were receiving money from the state that they were adopting these children from?
Absolutely, I did.
When was the first group of kids placed with the Staffords?
2009.
And how many kids were in that first group?
There was a total of 4 in the first group.
And where did that group of kids originate from?
Oregon.
Did you learn that throughout your investigation the names and ages of some of those kids?
I did.
And who were the kids placed from Oregon?
Now, to our listeners, we got the raw PCA, but we're going to only use first letters of these victims. Most of these victims are adults now, and their names were listed in the PCA, but we don't feel comfortable with listing them. So we're going to go ahead and go on, but we just wanted to explain that part right there. So we're going back to the answer. There was X and L, and there was 2 younger children that weren't able to be identified. The name is A and C.
And what were the approximate ages of A and C when they were placed with the Staffords?
They were younger, infant age when they were in the home.
And so now they would probably be adult age. Would that be correct or close to that?
That's correct.
Because of their age, when they lived with the Staffords, they were not capable of providing interviews?
No.
Okay. Did you end up interviewing L and X at some point during your investigation?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so prior to interviewing L and X, I guess let's kind of back up. Did you learn that the kids were placed from Oregon, that they were placed through the Oregon Department of Human Services, or that they were involved in their placement?
Yes, I did.
And as a part of the investigation, have we received records related to those kids from the Oregon Department of Human Services?
Yes, we have.
And in your review of notes from those records, were there things about Sonja's treatment of any of the kids that stood out to you that was concerning or relevant for your investigation?
Yes, there was.
And what were those things?
There were some notes that were a little concerning. Sonja had gotten upset. She was essentially, in my looking at them, was trying to get more money out of Oregon. There was activities such as that she went hoping to get more money from Oregon, had essentially told her that she was not going to receive additional money if she was going to do specific activities with the kids. They had a set amount that they were going to receive, and Sonja got upset. She made comments about how it was crazy, and she wanted to submit far and above what's reasonable so she can get as much money as she can.
What else did you find in your review of those notes about any treatment of specifically X that was concerning?
There was very concerning notes with X, where there was a mention of alarms being put on bedroom doors. There was also concerns that Sonja was locking X in his bedroom for an unreasonable amount of time. There was one specific note that Sonja had made a comment about him being in his room for 10 hours. She didn't think that it was going to essentially fix the issue that they were having. There were also notes about how X only had 6 more hours to do. And eventually, there was an overall concern about his mental health. He later disclosed to the principal at the school that he was attending, that he was wanting to harm himself.
Was there also a note from your review that Sonja had taken X's pillow and mattress away from him for a week as punishment?
Yes, there was.
And so you had mentioned that there was a situation where X wrote a note saying he wanted to harm himself. What was the end result of that note and essentially Sonja's treatment of X with the children from Oregon?
X was eventually, or shortly after the disclosure of the note, he was admitted to Meadows for treatment. Now, pausing right there for a second, Meadows is a mental institution near Bloomington, Indiana. It's the bigger town around the neck of the woods we live in. The kids shortly after, were removed when X was released. And Sonja made comments about how the other 3 children were going to suffer because of the psycho kid.
Is there any documentation about her reaction specifically? I know you said that she made a comment about the other children suffering, but was there any reaction that they had documented when she was told it was basically a failed adoption?
Yes, there was notes she initially reacted that she was calm and then became very upset and hysterical, and then made the comment about how the 3 children were going to suffer and quoted as X being the psycho child.
We've talked about X and notes that were included from Oregon DHS, But were there any mentions about anything involving L that would eventually become relevant in your investigation?
Yes. So Elle had talked about the chore chart, which we learned through multiple interviews with other children is something that had been going on there.
And so I asked you earlier if at some point you were able to interview L and X. Did that happen in your investigation?
Yes, it did.
And when you interviewed L, did she corroborate some of what was provided in the notes from Oregon DHS?
She did.
What did she specifically corroborate that you were able to observe in the notes?
She had also talked about the chore chart. She talked about the treatment of X, and she wasn't sure initially. She wasn't sure if the reason that they were all removed was because of X. She had a gut feeling X had disclosed something or something had happened. She did talk about X's treatment, how it was different, and that she was overall concerned about his well-being. She had said something happened to X while they were there, but she wasn't sure what.
When you were interviewing L, did she also give you a description of what the property had looked like when she or her siblings were out there in 2009, 2010 time period?
She did. She said that when they were placed in the home, there was just the main residence, there was a barn, and a chicken coop on the property.
Did L tell you about alarms being on the door and being sent to her room basically day and night when she was with the Staffords?
She did. She talked about the alarms and how if they were to open up the doors after they had been sent to their room, the alarms would go off in the house. And she had talked about in the evening, about 6 p.m., how they would have to go to their rooms for the night and didn't come out until the following morning.
Did she mention anything about what the food situation was like living with the Staffords?
She did. She talked about how they were only allowed to eat healthy food. They didn't get snacks, and they were only allowed to eat when Sonja would let them eat.
Did she mention about locks being on the pantry and the kitchen?
She did. She talked about there being locks on the door on the pantry, so they couldn't access any of the food in there.
Did Elle tell you anything about an adoption website that Sonja had showed her while Elle was living with them?
She did. There was one particular instance that I had discussed. She said that Sonja had called her into her room that she was in, being Sonja. Sonja was on her computer on a website. She told Elle that this is where she looks for kids, referring to it as shopping for kids.
Wow.
That's fucked up.
And so you've talked about Elle describing the treatment that X received. Was there anything else that she had mentioned in her interview that was relevant to your investigation?
She did mention one incident. She talked about X having issues with going to the bathroom at night. She talked about how Sonja would give him laxatives in ice cream. She said there was one additional incident where she did this and put more laxatives in the ice cream than normal. Sonja apparently made some kind of comment about it, but she couldn't articulate what it was. And it would cause X, since he was locked in his bedroom, to have essentially accidents all through the night because he couldn't get out to use the restroom.
Did you learn anything about whether X was provided with like a pull-up or a training potty or anything when he was locked in his room?
I did. He was given essentially a bottle, and he, during his interview, referred to it as a piss bottle. He was given an option to wear a diaper or have described like a porta potty, like for a small child in the bedroom with him.
And so I'm kind of jumping ahead, but after you interviewed Elle, then did you also interview X?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and how was the interview conducted?
Well, with X, it was done on audio, an audio recording. I, myself, and Detective Shane Norris had actually went to Oregon to do the interviews. Unfortunately, due to X's work schedule, we had some scheduling conflicts. So prior to us having to leave to come back to Indiana, I was able to get him on the phone and do an interview with him prior to leaving.
And during his interview, did he corroborate what you had learned from Elle as well as what you had learned from records from the Oregon DHS?
Yes, he did.
Was there anything else about his interview that stood out to you or that was relevant for your investigation that we haven't talked about?
There sure was. He had mentioned some physical punishments that he received. He referred to a 4-inch thick paddle, and he referred to it as the overboard. And then we would learn more about the paddles as we were interviewed the other kids throughout the years that were in the home.
So the Oregon group of children was eventually removed. And what was the year that they were removed from the home?
They were removed in 2010.
Were there any children placed after the first group of kids were removed?
Yes, there was. Shoo. Okay, folks, man. Me and Julie have to take a little bit of a break from reading this probable cause affidavit because we're both up in our feelings up in this shit, man. This is weird. So until this probable cause affidavit, which I want to mention, we pretty much got the first one that was printed at the press conference. We wasn't aware that there were 4 children from Oregon and were removed from Oregon DHS in 2010.
Yeah, Oregon came to Indiana and got those kids back and took them back out there.
Took them. And to kind of summarize, what happened is Sonja was calling DCS. I call it DCS, but it's DHS in Oregon. Y'all know what the fuck I'm talking about. She wanted more money, more money, more money. She was abusing the shit out of these kids at that point in this story.
Locking them in their bedrooms.
Alarms on the bedrooms, giving them a water bottle to piss in. And you know, that the shit about putting laxatives in the ice cream and then locking the little boy up in the room, and then the poor little boy probably shitting all over himself in his room, and then probably punishing him
for doing that.
For not being able to hold his poop, man.
That's pure evil. Pure evil. Phew.
That's got me like breathing a little bit funny, folks, man. We want to get through this PCA with y'all, man, but
it's horrible.
It's a lot. It's a lot. And I'll tell you what, we're gonna bite our lip, and we're gonna get through it a little bit more. But I do want you guys to realize that there were 4 children removed in 2010, and as you're gonna see when we start back up in the PCA, there were more children added in just less than a year later. So right back into the PCA, the next question was...
And what was the next group of children?
The next group came from Indiana. They were in the home in 2011, which there was victim 3, victim 10, victim 11, and victim 1.
And do you know the ages of each of those kids when they were placed with the Staffords?
Victim 3 was approximately 2 when she came to the home. Victim 10 was 8. Victim 11 was about 6 or 7. And then victim 1 was around 7 or 8 when they were in the home.
And so far, after the Indiana group was placed and adopted with the Staffords, what was the next group that was placed with them and adopted?
There was a group of 5 that came from Florida, which was victim 7, victim 6, victim 5, and victim 8. I'm sorry. There was 4 that came in that group. I apologize, from Florida. And folks, we can't get mad at him for tripping because there is 33 victims here. And this detective is trying to keep his composure. Next question.
Did this group of siblings have 2 additional siblings, I believe C and C, that were older?
Yes, they did.
Okay, and where those 2 were not adopted by the Staffords, is that correct?
That is correct. They returned back to Florida. FYI, 69 South learned through an interview that we have had with one of the victims that the older 2 victims that they're talking about in the PCA right now, they showed up and they were 17, 18 years old. They saw the situation that was going on, and they was like, F this. They split back to Florida because they were old enough to make a choice. Back to the PCA question.
And can you give the court approximate ages for victim 7, victim 6, and victim 8 when they were adopted?
Victim 7 was 13. Victim 6 was 11. Victim 5 was 9. Victim 8 was about 7 years old.
And after the this group of Florida children was adopted, what was the next group that the Staffords had placed in their home?
Actually, there was another group that came from Florida. They were victim 9, victim 2, and victim 4. Also, there was an older sister named M that came from Florida as well.
Were all 4 of those kids from Florida adopted?
They were not.
And I don't know if I asked, but when were they placed?
2015.
And they weren't all adopted, I guess. How many of them were and which ones?
There were 3, victim 9, victim 2, and victim 4. They were adopted.
And so M was not part of the group that got adopted.
She was not.
And we talked about victim 9. Is victim 9's name different now?
Yes, at some point, victim 9 had his name changed to victim 9. So he is now legally as victim 9. And we just want to point out that those are redacted. So victim 9 is
victim 9.
His victim 9 is victim 9. Their name is not really victim 9. They're all 3 redacted. So that's what it is. Next question.
Okay, so we've talked briefly about receiving money throughout all of this, but did you learn through your investigation that the Staffords received money from Indiana and Florida for all of the groups of children that were placed in their home?
Yes, I did.
And we have our investigator, Brett Bays, who is going to talk more about the financials. But did you learn that some of these children, specifically from Florida, were covered by Medicaid when they were placed with the Staffords?
Yes, I did.
Did you learn about any agreements that the Staffords had made by accepting this money from either Florida or Indiana?
Yes, it was supposed to be used for the care of the children in the home.
And so for care of the children, did that mean they agreed to clothe and feed them while they had the children in their care?
Yes.
And so after the last group of kids were placed from Florida, did the Staffords foster any additional children that ended up becoming important in your investigation?
Unfortunately, they did.
And when did that take place?
That was arranged. Well, there was a group of 3 boys that were actually in the home at 2 different occasions. The most recent was 2023.
And what were the approximate ages of these 3 boys?
There was a minor child, which we're going to call minor child 1. He was about 10 the last time he was in the home. He also had a brother. We're going to call minor child 2, which is a minor as well. And minor child 3, which is minor child 3. They were both infant-aged children. I'm not sure of the exact age of them. They were ultimately interviewed or talked to due to their age in the case.
But minor child 1 is a child that would have been at an age that could have been interviewed?
Yes, he was.
And was he interviewed? And you'll talk about that later in your testimony.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so you said that they were placed with the Staffords a few times. Were they ever formally adopted by the Staffords?
No, they were not.
Did you receive some documentation or review some documentation or notes from the Indiana Department of Child Services regarding placement of the minor children with Sonja and Brian Stafford?
Yes, I did.
And was one of those documents that you were able to review a document entitled Resource Parent Role Acknowledgement?
Yes, it was.
And was that a document that was signed by Sonja Stafford?
Yes, it was.
And when did she sign that?
June 23rd, 2023.
Does that document contain a list of punishments that foster parents are explicitly told not to use on the children that are in their care?
Yes, it does.
And can you tell the court what's included on that list?
Well, it talks about corporal punishment to include spanking, physical exercise, running, or push-ups, things of that nature. It also talks about having proper health care, food, bedding, no types of shaking, no mechanical restraints, and having any placement in the type of a locked room.
And during the course of your investigation, did you learn that Sonja used almost all of these punishments on the children that she adopted over the last 13 years?
I certainly did.
Okay. So now that we've provided the court with some background and some context for the kids we're going to be discussing, you testified that you were assigned to this case on May 23rd, 2024. Was DCS involved on the date prior to that?
Yes, they were.
And you talked about kind of initial disclosures, or at least the initial information that you all had. What led to DCS being involved on May 22nd of this year?
So our sheriff's department was contacted on the 22nd, as well as DCS. So when our uniformed deputies arrived at the residence, Nicole Thompson, who is the FCM, the family case manager, was already on the scene, conducting her side of the investigation on the allegations that were reported. So then our uniformed officers assisted her and gathered information while they were there about the allegations.
And for the courts, I guess, purposes and understanding kind of where we are with the timelines, how many children were living with the Staffords on the 22nd of this year in May?
There were 3.
And which of these 3 children that we've talked about were living with the Staffords at this time?
It was victim 3, victim 4, and victim 2.
And victim 3, for context, is one of the girls that came with the very first group of kids that was adopted from Indiana in 2011, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and then victim 2 and victim 4 were from the very last group from Florida. They were adopted in 2015, correct?
That's also correct.
Okay, how many adults were living in the house on May 22nd of this year when DCS responded and got law enforcement involved?
There were 3.
Who were the 3 adults that were living there?
Brian, Sonia, and victim 11.
And how old was victim 11 in May of 2024?
She was 18.
And again, to provide some context, because we talked about a lot of different kids, is victim 11 one of the adopted children that has now become an adult?
Yes, she is.
What group of kids was she with?
She was with the first group from 2011 from Indiana.
And so you had mentioned that the sheriff's department had gotten involved and went out to assist essentially Nicole T., who was the FCM. Did victim 2, victim 3, and victim 4 disclose anything to Nicole that night when she was out there?
They did. They have disclosed some of the physical abuse that was going on and then things that had happened with Brian as far as the sexual allegations.
Did any of the girls have any injuries that Nicole was able to observe that night?
They did. Victim 4 had some marks and scratches on her right thigh. Victim 3 had what was later to be found as frostbite scars, which, well, we'll kind of talk about in a little bit. I think I've got photographs as well. And then victim 2 had scratches on her face.
Did they also tell Nicole about paddles that had been used during part of the physical abuse or part of the discipline that Sonja would use?
Yes, they did.
And was Nicole able to photograph any of the paddles that were used?
She was. She was able to get photographs of one of the paddles.
I'm going to show you what I've marked as State's Exhibit 1. Is that a picture of one of the paddles that Nicole was able to photograph the night that she was out there on May 22nd, 2024?
Yes, it is.
Now, for the court's purposes, Judge, if we could admit that, and then they admit it, the court says Exhibit 1 is entered.
They're basically admitting into evidence the pictures of this big-ass paddle that they call overboard. The children call the paddle overboard. 4-inch thick is what was alleged.
Yeah, whew.
That's rough.
And so you mentioned that the sheriff's department went as sort of an assist with DCS. At that time, the sheriff's department had body cameras. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And so you were able to, after reviewing the body cam, get a sense of how long everyone was out there that night?
Yes, I was.
How long was DCS and law enforcement and the parties out there?
They were out there for an extended period of time. I'd say a couple of hours, maybe several hours, and that they were out of the house, that night.
And during that time that DCS and law enforcement was present at the Stafford home, did any of the older adopted kids who were no longer living on the property arrive and interact with law enforcement?
Yes, they did.
Which kids showed up?
Well, victim 10 and victim 5 showed up.
And again, kind of to orient the court, since we've talked about so many different kids, which group did victim 10 come with?
Well, victim 10 was in the first group from Indiana, and then victim 5 was in the next group that came from Florida in 2013.
Okay, and so what information did victim 10 provide when he was on the scene on the 22nd about living with the Staffords?
He had talked about that there was physical and sexual abuse that was going on in the home. He also talked about how when DCS was called out to investigate prior allegations, that they were told to lie and essentially tell DCS that there was nothing going on at the residence.
What about victim 5?
Well, victim 5 had disclosed an incident where she had been drugged by the hair, and then also physical abuse that was going on in the home.
And so was it discovered on the 22nd when DCS was out there that victim 11, one of their adopted children, was pregnant with Brian's child?
Unfortunately, yes.
And I think you testified that at that point, victim 11 was 18, correct?
She was.
Was it decided after DCS and law enforcement were at the property for a substantial amount of time that the 3 youngest girls we've talked about living there, victim 2, 3, and 4, were going to be removed from the Stafford's care?
Yes, once they learned about not only the physical abuse that was going on in the house, as well as the disclosure of the sexual abuse, DCS removed the children that night immediately.
And so after the 3 girls were removed from the property, were they then scheduled to be interviewed at Susie's place?
Yes, they were.
And what exactly, this is not on the script of this thing, but I just want to explain to people what Susie's place is. Now, Susie's place is a safe, neutral, non-leading, non-suggestive place for children to speak regarding allegations of crimes against them.
This is off script. Is that just an Indiana thing, or?
I don't know. I've never heard of it.
Sounds like a pretty cool place. I mean, it's a safe place where kids can go, hopefully. I wonder who's...
And talk, probably licensed psychologists and counselors that know how to interview kids without re-traumatizing them.
Right, because, I mean, you got DCS, you got the Sheriff's Department, you got the Staffords involved. Surely it's some kind of a
third party, a neutral third party.
At this point, a 4th or 5th neutral party.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, so let's jump back into our script here now.
Yes, ma'am.
When did that interview take place for the first round of interviews?
That was immediately the following day on May 23rd of 2024.
Okay, and so let's talk about victim 2's interview. And I think for purposes for the court to talk about both interviews, I think it makes the most sense. Can you explain for the court when victim 2 was interviewed a second time?
She was interviewed for the second time October 22nd of this year, 2024.
Okay, and so did victim 2 in her first Susie's Place interview give a picture of what life was like when she was living at the Stafford home?
She did. Initially, she said things they seemed okay. As the years went on and they discovered that Brian and victim 11 were having a child at some point, that victim 11 was pregnant, she said things kind of started to deteriorate. Things, kind of got worse. They started having more food restrictions. Certain foods they were not allowed to eat. There was a lot more physical abuse that was going on in the home with the children and a lot of things of that nature.
Okay, so let's talk about the food restrictions and what they were allowed to eat. What did victim 2 disclose about what their diet was like?
Oh, she talked about how they had separate food from Brian and Sonia. It was kept in a separate room in an outbuilding. It was actually the large barn on the property. They were allowed to eat for breakfast. Sometimes they'd get a little cup of yogurt. For lunch or dinner, they could either have a can of sardines, a thing of ramen, or maybe a thing of ravioli. She talked about how Brian and Sonia would have, like normal food, burgers, things of that nature. But those things that the kids were not allowed to eat. She also talked about some punishments that sometimes she would get a slice of bread with some ketchup on it.
Did she also talk about sometimes receiving like a peanut butter sandwich for lunch or something of that nature?
Yes, she did.
Okay. Did victim 2 disclose that this was the meal regimen that she and her 2 younger sisters, victim 3 and 4, were first forced to follow for 3 years?
She did.
And so she talked also a little bit about some punishments that happened in the home. Did she disclose what it was like with Sonja and kind of what their daily schedule looked like?
She did. She talked about how they would have to be up at a certain time in the morning. They would have a schedule. They would have their chore chart. They had to get up and do different types of labor on the farm. Then they would get to eat if their chores were done. Then they would get a limited time where they were allowed to do schoolwork. Then after their schoolwork was done, then it was right back to the farm work and the other chores that they had to do. Then they were able to eat their limited amount of dinner, and then they would go back to their room for the rest of the evening.
And did you get the impression, listening to both victims 2, first and second Susie's Place interview, that the girls essentially worked from sun up to sundown when they were at the Stafford property?
Yes, I did.
Did victim 2 also talk about a point system that she and her sisters were subjected to?
They did. It was like the button box that they talked about. They got a certain amount of points if they were late. So if they arrived late, for example, their morning chores, they would get points. If they didn't get a chore done properly, they got additional points. If they left, for example, I think some of the girls talked about if they left like a piece of clothing out, like a sock or something, they got more points on top of that and things like that. So that's how they kept.
And so you talked about earlier in your testimony that there was multiple kids, if not all of them have discussed a button box that was used. Was this the way that Sonja would keep track of who had points and how many?
Yes, it was.
And did you get the impression that after listening to victim 2's interview, as well as interviews from other children, that they got to the point where they were unable to work off the points that they had?
Yes. A lot of the kids had disclosed that it was almost impossible to get the points worked off. They would even talk about how they would be up throughout the night trying to write their sentences to essentially get the points down. But it was never ending. So they said it was impossible to get caught up.
And so did Sonja provide them with, and I'm going to use air quotes, option for how to work off their points?
She did.
And what were some of those options?
These kids discussed how they could do extra chores. They could write additional sentences and they would get their points off. They could do like physical activity to include running a certain amount of laps around the whole property of the farm. And essentially it was a way to try and get some of the points worked off of what they had earned or accumulated.
And so I want to make sure that the court's understanding what this kind of looks like. Did you gather from your investigation that it seemed like the girls had a set time that they woke up in the morning, had chores they had to do, and then if they weren't following this very tightly regimented schedule from Sonja, they would then have additional points that they would have to work on top of their original chores to remove those points?
That is correct.
Okay, and so were there things that you talked about, kind of food deprivation? Is that a way that something that she would use for punishment if they had extra points? Would they lose the option to eat?
They did. They were given the option to skip a meal or skip a snack or things like that, and that would essentially take some points off. Jeez.
So in addition to sentences, which we will revisit here in a minute, you talked about running as a way to work off some points. Did Sonja also give them an option of taking wax as a way to work off points?
Yes, she did. They had an option of where they could take wax from the paddle, and they would essentially also, get some of the points taken off.
And so in addition to her giving them what she called options, were there other forms of punishment that Sonja Stafford would use if the girls were behind on their schedule, or just, I suppose, if she was angry?
They had the sentences, the running. They could do extra chores or wax. Sometimes they even had to do chores outside in the Indiana cold, wearing just a bra and underwear. And then sometimes they would even withhold bath products from them so they couldn't properly shower within the home.
So we have talked about the sentences a few times. Can you give the court an idea of when Sonja would tell them, you have sentences to write? What would that mean?
So basically, that would, well, based on their age, they would have to find like a Bible verse or a quote that those equivalents of how old they were. So like if they were 13, it had to be 13 words long. If they were 17, it had to be 17 words long. And then they would have to, based on how many points they had, they would essentially have to write these sentences for that and try to work these points off. Some of the girls and kids disclosed that they would have to write thousands upon thousands of these sentences and would be up almost all the way through the night, all the way to the morning, trying to get them done because they had so many sentences to write.
Did one of the kids disclose writing about 25,000 sentences at one point?
Yes, they did.
And this is on top of the sentences that they would have to write as a form of punishment. This was on top of having their daily chores, their schoolwork, and whatever else Sonja deemed was necessary for them to do.
It is. They would talk about when they were in their room, like for the night, sitting up in their room and trying to write these sentences out throughout the night.
Did victim 2 ever disclose seeing Sonja push her younger sisters, victim 3 or 4?
Yes, she did.
What are some of the things that victim 2 disclosed witness seeing Sonja do?
Well, she talked about one incident where she saw victim 4 kind of throw her down the hill and rode her through some cow manure that was on the property. She also talked about how Sonja would grab some of the kids by the face and squeeze, which would result in scratches and things and injuries on their faces. Gosh.
I know we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but did any of the girls disclose Sonja using a slap down?
Yes, they did.
And what would a slap down look like?
Well, essentially, Sonja had names for both of her hands. She referred to one hand as Slappy. She referred to the other hand as Pappy. And she would take the girls, bend them over her knee, and just start going, essentially just slapping, beating them down on the child with those hands.
And so we talked about a little bit of victim 2's first interview, which she also interviewed the second time at Susie's place.
Yes, she was.
Okay, and so did she give, I guess, a better picture of some other details in her second interview, kind of the day-to-day life or treatment that Sonja gave the girls?
She did.
And so did she talk about how things were when she was first adopted by Brian and Sonja?
She did. She had mentioned that when they were first adopted, things seemed to be kind of okay. They were able to do, some activities, and then things slowly went away as the time with them extended.
And so did victim 2 have any sense of how long after she had been adopted that things started to change at the Stafford home?
She said it was about a few years.
When she was interviewed the second time at Susie's place, what did she tell you, or what did she disclose to the interviewer that stood out to you about her day-to-day activities?
She talked about she rarely got to play, rarely got to participate in any activities. She always had to do work, schoolwork, sentences, or was in bed. She talked about her chore schedule. She also talked about how she wasn't allowed to read unless it was for a special occasion. She discussed how Sonja told them that reading takes away time that they could be working.
Did she ever talk about a store that Sonja had on the property where she would sell various, items and things of that nature?
Yes, she did.
And was victim 2 required, as well as her younger sisters, to work in that store?
Yes.
What capacity was victim 2 working in that store?
She got product and stuff ready. She waited on customers as they came in and just kind of like basic work in the store.
And did she talk about how there was a logbook for the girls to write down if they waited on a customer that they would be entitled to get, an X amount of money?
She did. I believe the children also had like some beaded jewelry things like they had handmade to sell at the store. So they had like a notebook or a log. They would keep track of the items that they sold because they were under the impression that they were going to get a portion of that money that, from the sale of those items.
And did victim 2 ever see any money from what she was doing in the store?
She did not.
And so we have talked about sometimes as a punishment, Sonja would withhold bath products from the girls to use. Did you learn during your investigation through victim 2's interview, as well as additional interviews, that there was a certain days of the week that they were all allowed to shower on?
I did. They were only allowed to shower on Wednesdays and Sundays.
And who decided that?
Oh, Sonja.
Was there ever a time where during any of the girls' interviews they talked about the option being withheld from them as well if Sonja was angry about something?
Yes.
And so did victim 2 also give a picture of how many clothes the girls had, or if there was a limit to what they were allowed to have?
They did. They had talked about how they were only allowed to have one outfit. So they were allowed to have one shirt, one pair of pants, one pair of socks, one pair of bra, and one pair of underwear.
Did victim 2's interview reveal what happened to the adopted kids as they aged out of the farm?
She did. She talked about how the kids, as they would age out or get older, were essentially kicked off the property.
Did she also talk about, prior to that happening, the oldest kid, or the children, I guess, that would become the oldest next, that they would become Sonja's favorite?
She did.
And what did that look like?
Well, she talked about how when the kids got older or become more of, their favorites, they would get extra privileges. They'd have extra responsibilities. And there was also a system that encouraged the kids to essentially snitch or tell on the other children in the home. So if they were doing something they weren't supposed to, or their chores weren't getting done, they were rewarded for going to Sonja and telling her about, what was not getting done.
Did you get the impression from victim 2's interview that, and I believe she even used the phrase, the oldest kind of would bear the responsibility or burden of the farm on their shoulders?
Yes.
And so did it seem to you that victim 2 was, in addition to being responsible for her own chores, she was responsible for making sure that her younger siblings, victim 3 and 4, were doing what Sonja dictated they needed to do?
Yes.
So we've talked about the work schedule they had. We've also mentioned that they would have to do school. When did they have time for school during all of this?
So they had, as a part of their schedule, they had a limited time during the day that they could do their schooling or their lessons and things like that during the day. If they didn't get it done throughout a certain period, they would have to work on it through the evening. After all, on top of everything else they had to do during the day.
And so were the girls homeschooled?
Yes, they were.
Okay. Did you learn throughout their interviews that they used a variety of different homeschooling products or services throughout the time that they were at the Stafford's house?
Yes, I did.
And who was supposed to be their teacher?
Miss Sonja.
Did you learn throughout their interviews and eventually Sonja stopped providing any instructions?
I did. Several of the kids had disclosed and talked about how at some point Sonja essentially was not present, so they essentially had to fend for themselves. They also talked about how if they didn't get a perfect score or every single question right, they essentially had to go back and redo it until it was perfect.
And I know you mentioned that victim 2 had disclosed one form of punishment that she had received was she got a piece of bread with ketchup on it. Was that if she was behind in school?
Yes, if she was behind in school, there was one of her punishments for it until she was caught up.
Was another one of her punishments for being behind in school having Sonja withhold a coat in the wintertime until she was caught up?
Yes.
And did you learn that the girls didn't finish school last year as a result of Sonja's lack of instruction?
I did.
Now we talked about the food regimen. Did victim 2 disclose in her interview if Sonja ever explained why the girls were on this schedule?
She did. There was comments made by Sonja that they weren't worth the money for the food, so they essentially had cheaper items that weren't, they were allowed to eat cheap stuff.
In addition to basically doing all of the work that the girls talked about, did you also learn that it became victim 2's responsibility to cook for her adopted father, Brian?
Yes, I did.
And did victim 2 talk about whether Brian was aware that the girls were on this restricted diet?
She did, because she made comments during her interviews that even though the food that she made for Brian was different, she wasn't allowed to partake in any of that. She was still required to eat the items that, had gotten for them.
And did she disclose him making a comment sort of along the lines of, I know that this is what it is, and this is what you have to do, but there's nothing that I can do about it?
She did.
Did victim 2 talk about what special occasions or holidays looked like when she was living with the Staffords?
They did. Well, not only victim 2, but some of the other children as well talked about how they weren't allowed to participate in any of the special occasions. So whether it was birthdays, Christmas, family gatherings, things like that, they weren't allowed to participate in those activities.
And family gatherings, would that include if Sonja and Brian had their surviving biological kids, Kelsey and Matt, over?
Yes, it would.
Okay, and did victim 2 talk about Christmas?
She did.
What happened on Christmas with the Staffords?
She wasn't essentially able to participate. If they did get gifts, they weren't given to them. Sonja would take the gifts and lock them up either in closets, or maybe a couple of years later they would have access to those. But they essentially weren't shown the gifts. They were taken away from them, and they weren't allowed to have them.
Did victim 2 talk about Thanksgiving and anything that ever happened with that holiday?
She did. She did as well. They had mentioned that there was Thanksgiving event at the Stafford's house. Victim 8 had came up and was talking to Brad, which is Brian's brother, and had essentially said, goodbye, I'll see you later, I've got to go to bed. And it was like 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Brad, had family that was there and mentioned or had asked victim 8, Will, it's only 5 or 6 o'clock. Why are you going to bed? He said, well, I have to. It's time for me to go. And Sonja had overheard that conversation and blew up, got angry, and essentially told Brad and the other family members that don't question her mothering skills, or her mothering habits. And then victim 8 was punished and went to his room.
And victim 8, sort of to orient the record in the court again for where victim 8 fell, was he with the first group of kids that was adopted from Florida?
Yes, he was.
Were there certain rooms in the house that the girls, victims 2 and 3 and 4, were not allowed to go in?
Yes, they weren't allowed to go into Sonja and Brian's bedroom. They weren't allowed to go in the kitchen.
During both of victim 2's interviews, did she disclose that she and all of her siblings were told to lie about what was going on at the farm?
Yes, they were.
And who told her to lie?
She was told essentially any authority figure, essentially DCS was the main party that would come out to the house and they would have to lie to.
By Sonja?
Yes.
Okay. And what was she told to lie about specifically? Did she disclose that?
Any stuff that was going on the property.
Did Sonja make any threats to victim 2 or to the other kids about what would happen if they didn't lie, if DCS were coming out?
They mentioned that she had threatened the girls and told them essentially they were all going to be separated, never see each other again. She said that Brian or Sonja could go to jail, things like that.
So she told these kids that they would basically never see their siblings again unless they lied to DCS.
Yes.
And so you kind of talked about it a little bit in your testimony. Did you learn from victim 2's interview that things with Sonja got much worse over the last year that the girls were living with her?
Yes.
And what was the reason for that change?
Sonia had found out that Brian and victim 11 were in a relationship.
And you said Sonja had found out. Were the girls, victim 2, victim 3, and victim 4 also aware of this?
Yes, they were.
And I know we've mentioned it a couple times, but just for clarification, victim 11 was one of the adopted daughters of Brian and Sonja from the first group of kids from Indiana in 2011, correct?
That is correct.
And so in addition to Brian's relationship with victim 11, did victim 2 disclose anything related to Brian and her?
She did.
What did she disclose about Brian and what happened to her?
We're going to stop the PCA recording and skid at that time. There is just so much. It is emotionally charging and triggering for me and Julie to even read this stuff. It's so disgusting. The PCA is getting ready to get even worse than this last hour that we read to you guys, but we are going to get right back at it.
And we will be dropping the rest of this tomorrow evening, so tune in. I'm not exactly sure what time, but if you follow our Facebook at Podcast 69 South, you will be notified there for whenever the drop is, and we will post.
So until tomorrow, when you hear the rest of this PCA, man, we hope you have a good day, good evening, whatever.